spoken in front of big stages and on TED, and you're an author. So I think it's quite fascinating, your experiences, also the work you're doing. Maybe you can share a little bit about your background. And I know we spoke briefly before. You probably can go on for a while, but yeah, so really in terms of that self-leadership and what brought you to where you are right now. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I always love Steve Jobs' commencement speech at Stanford, where he talked about joining the dots backwards. Because my journey started with my first degree, which was actually physiotherapy, which in itself was not my intent. I was a good science student at an English grammar school. They joined my girls' grammar school with my boys' grammar school with the girls' high school just before my A-levels, and I got distracted. That was my first disruption. And I did physiotherapy as a second option. Now, I graduated way back in 1982. This is before sports psychology. It's before positive psychology. I did a couple of years in hospitals, and then I did what most male physiotherapists did, was I worked with sports teams. And initially, of course, in the rehabilitation, fixing up problems, but then I got involved in sports conditioning, in performance, and of course, that naturally transcends into the mental attitude. And how one sports person or one sports team can look at being behind the eight ball, as it were, or being down at halftime. What's the mental attitude that turns that around? We looked at visualization and goal setting, hypnosis, the linguistics, framing, coaching. So I moved to Australia in the late 80s, and I was an entrepreneur. I set up a chain of physiotherapy, acupuncture clinics. By this time, I had a postgraduate Chinese medicine, and I began speaking and coaching around performance. And what happened was that side of the business took off, and I began to coach business teams. And at that time, my health business got disrupted. This was around the year 2000. I'd invested in holistic wellness centers ahead of my time. And then the fitness industry hit Australia, and everything was about a membership and how cheap they could sell you a membership, recognizing, of course, that most people didn't go. So in the year 2000, I lost everything. I was broke, and I had one of those life moments. I could go back and work as a physiotherapist. And I realized, well, no, I was really passionate about transformation, people taking ownership and an impact. And I thought, well, if I can't apply it to myself, what am I going to do? I'm a charlatan teaching anybody else. So in 2000, I was absolutely broke. By 2003, I had an international consulting business, working with clients like Singapore Airlines, traveling around the world, teaching them how to change mindsets. And in that process, I looked at what are the strategies that work. And that resulted in my first book on self-leadership. I've written two. The first book on self-leadership, which was published in 2012. So now what I do is I help leaders, either up-and-coming leaders or established leaders, develop their leadership teams and create a self-leadership culture so that they can manage their own internal and external disruptions.
Fantastic. And then, so you said you had two books. So what was the second book again?
Well, they're both called Self-Leadership.
Yes.
The first one is published out of New York with McGraw-Hill, and it's called Self-Leadership: How to Become a More Successful, Efficient, and Effective Leader from the Inside Out. And the second book I self-published in 2016. This is the easy read, because people want to read a book in under an hour. And that book's called Self-Leadership: 12 Mindsets and Methods for Success. And they're both available on Amazon.